everyone, and welcome to today's keynote presentation titled Getting into the Brain, the Ethics of Invasive Human Neuroscience Research. This webinar is part of the 10th Annual Neuroscience virtual event, and I'm Susie Valdez of LabRoots, and I will be your moderator for today's event. Today's educational web seminar is presented by LabRoots. So let's get started. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that this event is interactive, and we encourage you to first participate by communicating with other attendees using our new live chat feature during this presentation. You can find this live chat located at the right of your screen. Now, you can also participate by submitting as many questions as you want during this presentation. To do so, simply type them into the Ask a Question box and click send. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation. Now, if you have any trouble seeing or hearing this presentation, just click on the help desk button located at the bottom of your screen within the navigation bar from the lobby. Finally, as a reminder, this presentation is educational and offers free continuing education credits. Click on the continuing education credits link located at the abstract window below the presentation window and follow the process to obtain those credits. I now present today's speaker, Dr. Ashley Feinsinger. Dr. Feinsinger is an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Medicine at the affiliated faculty department of philosophy at UCLA. For a complete biography of our speakers, please visit the Biography tab at the left of your screen. Dr. Feinsinger, welcome. You may now begin your presentation.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to take a moment to thank LabRoots and the NIH BRAIN Initiative for having me here today to talk about the ethics of invasive human neuroscience research. I think neuroethics is a really important topic to talk about in the context of cross-cutting impacts of scientific collaboration, and I'm quite happy to be able to share some of the collaborations I've been a part of today and some of the results and the work of those team efforts. So an outline of what we'll chat about today is we'll start by giving a broad overview of invasive human neuroscience research, and particularly the types of research that my lab is interested in. We'll survey the ethical issues at the forefront of that research. I will present an initial framework for developing best practices in this space and some of the collaborative work that we've done with investigators across the country. I'll share some participant narratives and motivate the importance of having that perspective as well in answering some of these ethical questions. And I'll end with sharing the next steps for some of the projects we're doing and talk a little bit about how my team approaches collaborative neuroethics research. So the learning objectives will be, by the end of the session, we'll be able to explain the fundamental ethical challenges of basic human neuroscience research. And we'll be able to evaluate research practices against two leading ethical principles. The first is maintaining the integrity of clinical care in space, and the second is ensuring the voluntariness of participation. So I want to just start by acknowledging my incredible lab members. You'll see them at the top. My lab works on the ethics of basic human neuroscience research, and we ask questions about consent, why participants join these types of studies, what participants value, and in general, what risks are permissible to subject participants to for the sake of answering questions about the brain. And so to this end, we really do work in close collaboration with philosophers, neuroscientists, neurosurgeons, and behavioral decision-making experts to answer these questions in a collaborative way. And we use a variety of different methodologies, including qualitative and quantitative methods, as well as the tools of philosophy, so conceptual analysis and things like that. And hopefully we'll be able to see some of those methods throughout the talk today. I want to also thank you to the BRAIN Initiative, who funds my lab, and to Dr. Nader Paradian, who's my co-PI. This work wouldn't have been possible without this really fantastic team. So the kinds of research that my lab focuses on is basic intracranial human neuroscience studies. So this is research that is aimed at understanding the fundamental workings of the human brain. So research that is not guided by providing a clinical benefit, a therapeutic benefit to participants, but instead guided by really answering a scientific question, understanding the brain. And it involves recording or stimulation inside the human skull. These studies are conducted in close concert with neurosurgical interventions. And in fact, they currently require the involvement of neurosurgical patients. So patients with implanted wires or devices for clinical reasons. These patients really provide researchers with an opportunity to peer into the brain in ways that would otherwise not be ethically permissible, right? And part of that is because most of the risk of intracranial recordings and modulation is already assumed in a clinical environment for these patients. So here's just a kind of survey of the types of studies that we might be interested in when we're talking about this space. So first, in one, you have an example of a patient who may have an RNS device, and researchers may take advantage of that device by simply taking extra recordings from it in a lab setting. Second, researchers might record through modifications of clinically indicated implants or wires, right, for research purposes. So this might be if a patient is having wires placed for recordings during a EMU stay, so an epilepsy monitoring unit stay, researchers might modify those wires a bit so that they could record and learn about individual neurons firing, something like that. In the third case, researchers may record through extra temporary electrodes that are placed onto a patient's brain, say during a deep brain stimulation device surgery. So a patient who has Parkinson's, for example, who may be undergoing surgery for a DBS device would then consent to do extra tasks in the operating room so researchers could answer some basic questions about the brain, learn about movement, learn about memory, stuff like that. And in 4, we have a little bit of a different scenario, but it falls within the scope of this kind of research, is research conducted as part of an investigational device trial, or that makes use of a Utah array that's implanted, say, as part of a BCI study. I think it's important to look not just at the studies through the kind of lens of looking at the technology and looking at the brain, but to also look at the study through the lens of the patient, right? So here are some of the examples of participants who make these studies possible. So in the first column, we have an example of a participant who has an RNS device, who is also using a mobile brain monitoring device that works in conjunction with the RNS system, and who may come to the lab to do various movement tasks for researchers. In 2, you have an example of a patient who's participating in basic science research during their epilepsy monitoring unit stay. In 3, you have a patient who is moving a joystick as part of basic science research during their DBS surgery. And in 4, you have an example of a patient as part of a BCI trial who is playing the piano using neural brain control based on basic science decoding principles, right, derived from kind of ongoing research. And I think these 4 types of research are different, and we'll talk about their differences in a second, but they're also united by 3 things. So they share the goal of understanding basic science questions about the brain. There is an absence of near-term therapeutic benefit, right? So not only is it the case that these types of studies aren't really aimed at providing these particular patients with benefits, but many of these studies aren't, you know, they may be exploratory. They may not even really be kind of at the stage where there's a kind of foreseeable clinical benefit in the near future. And 3, all of these studies, again, make use of intracranial recordings and stimulations in subjects who either have a clinical need for a neurosurgical intervention or whose condition allows them to undergo one for the sake of a study. So as invasive technical capabilities advance, right, so as we improve our neurotechnology, our implants, our recording possibilities, and as we learn more about the brain and the conditions that these techniques can address, there will be more and more patients with these devices in their heads, and they'll be in more parts of the brain, and thus provide us with more opportunities for research, which I think is a really wonderful thing, but it also really kind of highlights how important it is to ask ethical questions about this research at this point in time. So here is the broadest ethical question we could ask, and the one that my lab is really interested in. Should we utilize these opportunities to study the brain? And I think, depending on the audience, I think maybe the audience that I'm speaking to today, there may be a resounding kind of yes, of course. And I don't disagree with that. So perhaps the question is a slightly modified one. Maybe it's something like, when should we utilize these opportunities, or under what conditions? What are the constraints, right? What types of things do we need to be responsive to ethically as we utilize these opportunities? And I want to draw your attention to two things. The first is that as you look at these pictures together, from my perspective, the thing that strikes me as I look at these pictures and I think about the ethics question, the thing that stands out to me is risk, right? And a particular type of risk of physical harm to the brain. And I think that's a very important question to ask when we talk about the neuroethics of these studies. And you might think that's a question for neurosurgeons and neuroscientists. After all, I'm a philosopher. I don't know quite a lot about, the risks of a wire in a particular part of the brain. And it's very much an empirical question. What are the possible risks for the patients in these studies? But notice 2 points. The first is that physical risks, in terms of their importance for ethics, are always assessed in relation to benefits, right? So the question about risk is not just what risks are there and how likely are they to happen, but it's also how important are those risks to us as a society, to the patients themselves. What benefits are worth what risks? And that is very much not purely an empirical question. That is a question that, requires an understanding of our values as a society. And the second point is that as the physical risks of harm to the brain get smaller, as we improve our techniques and improve our surgical capabilities, other ethical questions kind of come to the forefront. And so we're going to have to grapple with a wide range of questions, even if risks keep getting less and less with some of these interventions. So as a way to kind of make very salient how complex answering this ethical question is, I like to use this chart, and I like to walk through it a little bit to think about the differences between all the studies we just looked at and how you might think about the different dimensions of ethics in this space. So this is a chart. This is something my lab's been working on for a while. It's not complete. It doesn't represent a full scope of the important features of these studies, but it's a start. So you might walk, up and down. You'll see types of categories or features of studies that we think are really ethically important, and then going across left to right, some examples of the sub-questions you might ask to figure out, where does your study fit, right? Where does your study fit, and how might that affect what you need to think about as you're designing consent or as you're recruiting patients, for example. So we can take a little walk through this chart. I won't spend too much time on it, but I'll go rather quickly. So first, we just talked about risks and how complex that is for thinking about ethics. But you might think, let's look at it from the different types of studies. The kinds of risks are different. If you have a kind of chronic implant patient with an RNS system that's coming to the lab to perform research tasks, or whether you have a patient in an intraoperative setting, different kinds of risks. The RNS patient maybe has almost no extra surgical risk for doing the research because they're out of the surgical context. They already have the implant, but they might drain their battery faster. They might have to pause their therapy, depending on the timing of the research. And that's a kind of risk that deserves, serious consideration. Questions about uncertainties. So we know in intraoperative research, so a patient is getting a DBS device put in their brain, and they will kind of pause, or at the end of that, spend 30 minutes now doing research tasks. So they might move a joystick or look at a screen as part of that task. Well, we know that extra time in the operating room kind of increases surgical risks, infection, stuff like that. But how much time correlates with how much risk is a difficult thing to quantify and a difficult thing to communicate to patients. So how uncertain are those risks, and how might that affect your practices? As we kind of walk down this chart, benefit is a really important category, and it also has quite a lot of nuance, right? So all of the studies I opened with by saying they're non-therapeutic. so they don't offer clinical benefits to patients, right? So any risks that patients take on, it's for the sake of knowledge about the brain, to learn stuff about the brain. Well, are there other types of benefits? Are there non-clinical benefits for the studies? And that might change depending on which study you're in. How closely related is the knowledge of the research to the patient's own condition? That might matter, right? So you could imagine a patient who has Parkinson's, but the research that they're participating in has to do with memory, right? Not necessarily has to do with understanding how movement works. And that might matter to thinking about how to talk with the patient and how to treat them. Differences in participant population, right? So the patients who participate in this research have a wide range of diagnoses, and that is expanding. We know that DBS is, in the research phases for treatment refractory depression. It's approved for OCD, but it's also being researched for things like chronic low back pain. And how do chronic low back pain patients differ than dystonia patients, right? What are the vulnerabilities there? What is their kind of lived experience like? What might we need to build into the research process to make sure that they're kind of treated in the right way? Team constitution. What does the research team look like? Is there a high prevalence of surgeons who are also the lead investigator? How might that affect how we approach patients? We can talk about that more in a bit. Are there non-clinicians on the team, right? And might that affect also what kind of training we want to make sure the team has? Are there tech companies in the room during surgeries and so on? Thinking about the relationship between care and research. So as we looked at those 4 studies, not only did they kind of differ in their risk profile, maybe they also differ in invasiveness. That's a tricky concept to think about. But they also differ in, how close in time and space the clinical care of the patient is with the research. So again, intraoperative research is during a clinically indicated surgery, but a BCI study, all of the clinical care is kind of subsumed under the research. So those different relationships may also impact ethical considerations. And lastly, just for now, levels of participant involvement and kinds of participant involvement. This is something that my group just recently started thinking about. So not just, when are patients signing up for research? Is it during a surgery, in the hospital, in their EMU stay, out of a clinic altogether? But what space are they in? Are they in a clinical space? Would that, contribute to misconceptions about whether what they're doing is part of their care or part of research? And also the kind of involvement involved in perhaps an intraoperative research study where you're moving a joystick might be very different than the kind of involvement of a 5-year-long BCI study where participants are coming to the lab twice a week for years, taking a kind of active role in the research process itself. And that might change the ethical landscape as well. So thinking about all these different contextual features and kind of taking a microscope to a group of studies that may seem a bit homogeneous at first, but are actually quite nuanced and different. Scholars and researchers have raised a whole host of ethical concerns about these types of studies. And on the screen, you'll just see a list of some of those. It doesn't include everything. But these are all questions that have to do not with what we can do, but with what we ought to do, right? So these are how you might begin to answer that question. Should we make use of these opportunities to study the brain? And my lab in particular is interested in 3 of these questions. The first is acceptable risk-benefit ratio, and we talked a little bit about that before, but we're really interested in how we make the determination that the risks of some of this research are worth the knowledge benefits. And that's a very difficult determination to make because on the face of it, it compares things that seem quite different, risks of harm to individuals' brains toward the benefit of learning something about the brain. And we're very interested in the role that patient perspectives can play in coming to make more inclusive value judgments about that. We're also interested in questions about disability and justice, right? So how can we develop technology? So all of this research involves neurotechnology, right? So how can we develop neurotechnology that doesn't kind of over-pathologize difference, right? That respects neurodiversity, that engages with the disability communities who may make use of this technology in the future. We also think about the fact that only patients with disabilities and certain neuro and psychiatric disorders can participate in the research, right? So because you have to have a clinical indication for neurosurgery in the first place, that means all of this research is being done on patients who belong to various kind of groups and they may share a kind of disability. So how do our judgments about even what risks are okay, right? How are those things impacted by how we think about disability and how we think about the quality of life of certain disabled individuals? Lastly, and the area that I'll focus on for most of the rest of the talk is questions about consent. And those questions include things like, can participants freely volunteer, really, for this type of research? And what would we have to do to ensure that? So I'd like to just narrow our topic down a little bit before I look at the proposed framework and some patient data. So let's look at consent and questions about consent in intraoperative studies. So just studies that take place during a patient's surgery. So consent, two really fundamental pillars of consent in research ethics is that participation in these studies be based on an informed decision and that participation be voluntary. And I think thinking about the particular context of intraoperative studies raises questions for both of these pillars. So first we might ask ourselves, look, these patients who are having surgical interventions for GBS, for treatment-resistant depression, may have some cognitive effects that may make us worry that they don't have the capacity to understand some of the nuances of this research, right? The research context might make us worry about the capacity of particular individuals to kind of weigh the risks and the benefits in a kind of reasonable way. Thinking about what patients understand independently of capacity, right? Do patients adequately understand the risks of the study when those risks are maybe difficult to quantify? Do they understand the benefits? Do they understand that this is completely non-therapeutic? Do they understand the goals of the study? How much do they understand the separation of care and research, right? This is a particular question for this type of research because the care and the research are happening together. So how could we figure out whether patients really understand that distinction? Thinking about voluntary participation, many people have worried about undue influence on enrollment, right? Particularly because many of the surgeons who are in charge of the clinical intervention are also the lead researchers in charge of the research, right? And so you might worry that this dual role can create a bit of a conflict of interest, both for investigators, but also impact patients, right? Who may feel pressure to enroll because it's their surgeon, who may worry about, impacts on their care if they say no, and, may kind of put a bit of a, I don't want to say coercion, but, in many ways might kind of nudge patients in ways that are problematic for thinking about free consent. The last topic here we'll talk about at the end if we have time. Thinking about the right to withdraw is also really complicated and has garnered a lot of attention in the neuroethics community in these studies. And I think the most straightforward way to make this point is that patients are in the middle of a surgery when the research happens. Many times they're awake, but their head is clamped down into a frame. And so literally they cannot get up and leave. And so then what does it mean to really give them a meaningful, right to withdraw? So after kind of laying the landscape a bit and probing you and hopefully making you quite concerned about the ethics of some of these studies, I'd like to just probe a little bit deeper, if I haven't done it already yet, and problematize the issue of consent even further. So on top of these kind of abstract considerations, there is currently no consensus on the best practices for consent and recruitment in these studies. Part of that has to do with the fact that federal recommendations kind of caution in one way, and IRBs might, you know, kind of differ in their approaches. And so we kind of have a bunch of differing methods. But I also think there's a real kind of conceptual struggle, not just that, you know, studies are different and so people are doing different things, but that we really quite don't know what to do with this context. So some of the questions that remain are things like practical questions. So who should do the consent? Should it be the surgeon? Should it be a researcher who's not a surgeon? Should it be someone who's not involved in the study altogether? And what are the reasons for and against those different options? And various research teams do it differently. This has raised some people to be really concerned about dual role consent. And we talked about this on the last slide, so I won't spend a long time here. But when you have the very same person who has therapeutic responsibilities to a patient, but then also playing a role with different responsibilities to the patient, how do you make sure there's not a conflict of interest? How do you make sure that doesn't undermine voluntariness? And how do you make sure that doesn't kind of promote the therapeutic misconception? So that's the view that the research will benefit me, so a view of patients that the research will benefit me even when it won't, right? So this kind of persistent misconception about how research is related to care. Concerns about dual role consent have led people like Christine Grady to propose something else, right? So maybe what we need is something like hybrid consent. Maybe we need to separate the surgeon from non-clinical researchers, and maybe the surgeon you know, participates in one part of the consent, explaining the risks and the benefits. After all, they may be the person who understands that the best. But then let's have a non-clinical person come in and do the rest of the consent, answer questions about withdrawing, answer questions about voluntariness and stuff like that. And that's garnered a lot of attention, and many labs do that. But even if we settle on, you know, okay, we're going to go with dual role, or we're not going to go with dual role, there still are a whole host of practical questions that we need to answer, and we need to answer them for each individual study. So the questions that remain: when is the best time to consent a patient? Thinking about this in the operating room or in an intraoperative study, we might worry, well, if we consent the patient too close to the surgical consent, they may not really fully appreciate what's happening in the research, right? The surgery may kind of eclipse the research. And there's some data that suggests that this might be the case. Should there be an ongoing consent process? Certainly for studies that take, you know, 5 years and have multiple points of patient involvement, ongoing consent is doable and a very good idea. What do we do in this case where the research is a kind of one-time thing and it's happening during the surgery? You might think, look, patients still will accrue different information over time, and feelings about participation may change even when they're in the OR. So maybe we should explore reconsent. But if we do that, should they be approached multiple times? How many times? At what intervals? When? Who should do the reconsent? Does reconsent even make sense when a patient is in the middle of surgery? Any of the concerns that we may have had about original consent, about undue influence, about understanding, about the separation of clinical care and research, you could imagine being even more concerned about them in the middle of a brain surgery, right? So we're left with these questions, and I won't take a long time. I could go on about this for forever. I'll just do a few more slides and then we'll move to the last part of the talk. But of critical importance, and I think a place that really has not yet garnered enough attention, is real concrete recommendations for making the right to withdraw a real possibility in the middle of a surgery. So this is a place where kind of collaborative efforts are really important, because I think everyone in the audience here would agree that the right to withdraw is kind of a crucial cornerstone of research ethics. But the challenge is, how do we carry out the duty that that right generates in us as researchers and as research teams in an intraoperative setting? If it's a negative right, that means it just requires that researchers not prevent somebody from withdrawing. But of course, it probably requires more than that. It might be a positive right, which means it might require us in the research setting to physically do things for patients to make that a possibility. And this might be different in the OR versus in the EMU, where patients literally cannot leave. When you're into a BCI study or an early feasibility study, patients have a device in their head, right? So making the right to withdraw a real possibility probably means removing the burden of taking that device out. So in response to this kind of really complicated set of studies and really deep concerns about consent, a group of more than 30 NIH-funded researchers who participate and who conduct this type of research, and myself, spent a long time trying to develop a framework to help researchers reflect on the practices of others and to provide a kind of shared basic framework for other people to develop practices, right? Have justified practices within a community. So this framework was recently published in Neuron, and I'm going to share a few of the basic principles of the framework and explain a little bit about how to use it. So you'll see the author list is quite large, so I like pointing that out. Not only is it quite large, but there's really only 2 ethicists in this group. The rest are really scientists and neurosurgeons funded by the BRAIN Initiative and who make up the Research Opportunities in Humans Consortium. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. So the proposed framework really starts by offering 2 very basic commitments that should guide the design and implementation of basic human intracranial research. And the 2 principles are here. The first is maintaining the integrity of clinical care and space. And the second is ensuring voluntariness of participation. I think these are interesting to offer as kind of first principles. I don't know how many ethicists or philosophers are in the audience, but number 1 is really fascinating. I think it reflects the unique experiences and knowledge of investigators, that they know what it's like to be in the space, to be in the surgical space, to be in the research space in a way that ethicists may not. And I think it's very telling that that was their first principle. Prioritizing the integrity of clinical care requires practices to ensure that care is not compromised purposefully or inadvertently. So this, you'll see when we go to the next slide, this principle is meant to generate a bunch of other normative guidelines about how to protect the clinical space. And in a way, this principle says, even though we're doing research in the clinical context, clinical care is first, right? So we're doctors first and researchers second, which is interesting. So the proposed framework kind of looks like this. I'll provide a little flow chart in a second to give an example of how to use it, but it's pretty straightforward. It's the basic commitment is on the left. The middle column is a set of kind of intermediary principles that come out of that commitment. So that commitment would support or justify the principles in the middle. And then on the right side, you'll see just examples from the investigators of current practices that they use that they think are kind of applications of that principle. And when, sometimes the group thought that they could use some new principles, some new practices, right? So you'll see current practices and also proposals for other things that they think should deserve research and effort into developing. I think if you go across the top, you can see, so maintaining the integrity of clinical care and space supports principle 1, which is that clinical care and research should be uncoupled, such that care be neither compromised by nor conditional on research participation, and this must be communicated to patients. And then you want to carry that out into specific practices. So some of the things researchers do that respond to this principle is they separate clinical and research consent in time, space, and personnel. So it's not specific to how they do it, right? That's interesting. So, but it's one way that they do it, right? But it doesn't say who's there and who's not there, at what time they do it, but that there's a separation in those literal consent discussions. And proposed practices, number 2 is interesting. Proposing that standardized videos are offered to provide a consistent external voice describing the separation of care and research. And so I think that's an interesting proposed practice, right? Letting someone else kind of come in and provide a neutral perspective for the patient to kind of hear some of the risks and the benefits from, as a way to mitigate some of that influence. The second principle is the same kind of table, but it outlines some principles responsive to the importance of voluntariness, and then gives some example practices that researchers use and some proposed practices that they would consider in the future. And it's notable that some of the principles don't have any current practices associated with them, but investigators felt like we should have some. And so you'll see, I think it's principle 6, there's only proposed practices, right? Consenting to research may require different cognitive decision-making capacities than consenting to care. And consent protocols should reflect this. No one had practices that reflected that yet, but they proposed some, right? So additional intellectual capacity or cognitive assessments, or seeking explicit confirmation of this understanding of the goals and the risks of the study. So this is just how you might use this in practice. So you might be able to make a flow chart for yourself of what practices you might need to implement depending on the type of research that you do. So you could use the framework 2 ways. You could kind of start from the commitment, walk down and see what types of practices you think you ought to implement, or you could take a practice that you already have and work backwards and see whether it's justified or falls under any of those principles and commitments. I think importantly, this is not an exhaustive list of the commitments and the principles and the practices, but it is a way to offer some kind of structure to a group of studies that are very different and very heterogeneous. I can't ever say that word, variable, there we go. And I think it's a very useful tool and a nice contribution to this field. So quickly, we can highlight maybe what's interesting about this proposal. Again, we mentioned this before, so you can go quickly. It focuses on the duality of the research context itself, and not just the duality of the role of the researcher. And that's notable because it creates, it generates a sense of ethical responsibility beyond the researcher, right? So anyone who's in that OR is in a kind of dual space. And so we may need practices and trainings and ways of interacting with each other that respect that go beyond just the researcher themselves. It kind of offers the beginning of a standardized tool for ethics without prescribing standardized practices. And I think that is a very difficult thing to do. It suggests that what this type of research needs is a kind of modular approach to thinking about consent and thinking about recruitment, where we need the ability to really respond to all those different nuances, as remember that taxonomy that we looked at before, different patient populations, different vulnerabilities, but we could have some standardized tool to help us navigate those cases in similar ways. It's a nice example of an ethical collaboration between investigators. And the proposal calls for patient participant input. So if you read the kind of paper or you look at some of the other practices, there really is a focused attention on more communication with patients, encouraging patients to talk with their families, finding more time to revisit concerns. And I think that this leads quite nicely into the last part of this discussion, which is really how do we move from this framework, which was very much developed from the perspective of investigators and what they experience in this space, to incorporating the patient experiences and the patient values. Because if we don't quite understand where patients are, when they're approached to participate, or what their concerns are, what it's like to kind of participate in this research, then the framework is not going to help, right? So I just want to quickly start by highlighting a study done by Wexler and her group, published in American, I think it was American Journal of Bioethics Empirical. And it's a study of 22 participants who consented to join intraoperative research during their DBS implantation surgery. And they were consented for the research. And then 5 days before the surgery took place, they participated in this study to see how much they could recall about informed consent, right? What did they kind of remember about the research at that point, right? So it was about a week after they did informed consent, but 5 days before they were about to do it. And here's the statistics, right? So only 22.7% correctly recalled the study risks. Only 36.4% correctly recalled the study purpose. Only 50% correctly recalled the study protocol, and 36.4% correctly recalled the study benefits. And I generally like to remain agnostic about this type of data because it's a small sample size and there's all sorts of reasons, why this might be the case. But at first glance, that is pretty shockingly low, right? And not only that, but it's like 5 days before they're about to go into surgery and then participate in research. So part of my lab's work also interviews patient participants, and we have some qualitative data from participants who also joined intraoperative research. And so this is part of our RF1. Dr. Paradian and myself are co-PIs, and we interviewed 15 participants who were participating in research during their surgery for Parkinson's, dystonia, epilepsy, and across 3 different types of research studies. And we found some similar things, right? So we found very minimal concerns with risks. So here I'm going to share some quotes from the patients with you. I didn't really think about that, and the patient's talking about risk. If there was a risk, they would have stopped it, or they wouldn't have done something like that. I mean, they wouldn't just keep asking me questions if there were risks. No, it didn't occur to me. I personally don't feel that I had any increased risk in participating in the research. Patients also express minimal understanding of the study, like the Wexler paper as well. I have no idea. I don't know what they were doing at all. Maybe they're mapping the brain. Maybe they're just training somebody how to apply an electrode. I have no idea. I just trust that somebody's getting something out of it. I don't know what the heck I've contributed to it, but I feel good about it, okay? There's not a whole lot of information out there on it, so why not? I like being part of something obviously bigger than myself. Patients also expressed a real immediate and ease to the decision to join. So Dr. X just asked nicely, would you like to be a part of this? And I went, sure, it's a study and it'll further knowledge. That's what I'm all about. Dr. X did say, you can take a minute to think about it. And I was like, I don't have to, just put me in the study. It was an easy decision for me. I was like, yeah, that's going to help someone else. Absolutely, I'll go for it. Really importantly, no patient said anything that indicated that they were under the therapeutic misconception, right? So that they thought that the research would benefit them or that they thought it was going to impact their care. And most cited the study as helping others, which is correct. And no one regretted participating. So patients really, they didn't really care very much about the risk or didn't know very much about the goals of the study, but in some sense, they weren't really confused. It's unclear what's happening, right? As they kind of shared more about their motivations for joining, I think some really interesting things came out that could help guide how we use our framework to develop best practices. So they shared a lot about the importance of basic brain research to them. You never know with the way research is. They could find a cure tomorrow or 10 years down the road, or they could never find the cure. But I feel as myself being like a donor. If a part of my body can help save somebody else, that's great. It may not benefit me, but it might benefit someone down the road. They talked about the impact of their illness on motivations to join, doing things in the memory of people that they had known that had passed away from their condition, and really citing the incredible importance of being able to help others. The last thing that came out of these interviews that in the last 2 minutes that I want to share, because I think it's crucial in developing best practices for consent, is the role that trust played for these patients, almost in talking about all aspects of the study. And I won't read all of these quotes, but you can look at them a bit as I'm talking. I'll read maybe one or two. So, no, I did, of course, trust him, but I didn't give it a great deal of thought. I just made the decision to participate. If I didn't trust him, then I wouldn't have agreed to have the surgery done at all. So if I'm trusting him with that, and if this is a way that can help anybody, ... I think this is quite interesting. So, what do we kind of make of all of this? I think a controversial take would be something like this. Patients who are approached to participate in research during their surgery think very little about the decision to join. They make it almost immediately. They will say yes, likely very quickly, and perhaps with only a vague understanding of the study goals and very little concern with the risks. But they'll do so out of feelings of robust trust and deference to their doctor and an appreciation for the value of basic science and helping others. So what do we do with that? How do we translate that into any practical steps about best practices? This is the next step that we're at in my lab, and I'm happy to share with you kind of like our plans of how to mix together investigators and patients, and you'll see we also have the public in here. So for us, the current steps and next steps are integrating patient values with practical proposals. So thinking about really proposing a formal reconsent process during the surgery, right? Requiring formal opportunities to withdraw during the surgery. Thinking about having someone other than the surgeon, someone other than the research team, be kind of a part of these conversations with the patient from the beginning, building that relationship with a third party, not just in the middle of the surgery, but from the beginning. And thinking about practices that really build trusting relationships, as trust was such a central feature of why participants are joining and what they're thinking about as they assess the risks and the benefits. How can we make sure that trust is not exploited and that the clinical team and the research team is really invested in that trusting relationship? We'll move a little bit more quickly through these. So kind of further exploration of patients' narratives. So we're moving to interview patients in the EMU setting, interviewing patients who have chronic implants, interviewing BCI patients. Also, further interviews with investigators and surveys of the public. The public is a really interesting third kind of perspective on some of these things. They're uninvolved in a way, but they're also a stakeholder. How can we think about what matters to patients by comparing it to what matters to a kind of uninvolved party? And then lastly, making progress on practical steps for involving patients. What kind of methodology should we be using when we approach patients to participate in some of these conversations? I'd like to end by just quickly noting that I think to answer all these questions, and I think, I hope that the way we've discussed ethics today has made you kind of believe this too. There's no way to answer these questions and what we just talked about today really without having an interdisciplinary team. And I think a lot of people talk about, embedding ethicists into science as the kind of standard, but we do both in our lab. We embed ethicists into science, we observe surgeries, we go to lab meetings, but we also embed scientists into ethics, right? So we invite scientists to participate in the discussions, to write the manuscripts and embed them in a methodology and kind of take responsibility for those arguments. And I think, the philosophy of our lab is really team building, trust, and time. We trust each other with really critical stances towards the work, and we reflect a really genuine openness about the possibility that some of this research should not be done, something that I think is crucial to making ethical progress in a space like neuroethics. So with that, I have a few more things on slides I'll let people look at while I say my goodbyes. But thank you so much for having me here today, and I look forward to discussing this with you all in the question and answer period.
Thank you, Dr. Feinsinger, for that informative presentation. We will now start the live Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have any questions you'd like to ask, please do so now. Just click on that Ask a Question box located on the far left of your screen. So let's get started. We already have some great questions coming in from our audience. Our first question: how are invasive brain technologies managed once implanted in research participants? And there's a second part: what are some of the ethical considerations applied for managing these technologies outside of the patient?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So in the talk, we focus mostly on, the event where the technology gets put in the patient, but we didn't touch on at all the host of ethical questions that come up when you think about, and then what, right? So there's a large body of research on post-trial obligations. So what are the obligations that researchers or companies, right, who are involved in developing this technology have towards patients who either are users of the technology for a therapeutic reason, but who also have kind of offered their brain for science, right, who have been part of an early feasibility study, or who have participated in research that uses those devices. So this is a really good question. I think at minimum, the ethical considerations that researchers think about are things like trying to maximize continued access, maintenance, making sure that there's resources in place so that patients who have this technology can make sure it works, can get care, and know about the possibility that that technology and those devices may not be supported forever. So especially if you participate in a study where the device is new or the technique is new, that device may not be made forever. And so how can we make sure that patients are prepared for that, and that we don't kind of leave them with devices in their head that are not supported, or that nobody kind of will take care of. So a lot of times it depends on what study you're asking about. If you're asking about something like a BCI study, there'll be very explicit discussions in the consent process about explantation. But you may be asking a different question, which is something like, what do we do about, how do we kind of make sure the devices are developed in appropriate ways outside of the patient? I think we would have to ask a tech person that, but I do think a crucial piece of that puzzle, again, is to talk to patients. What are their expectations, right, after those devices are implanted in their heads? Do they expect continued care? Do they expect to still have access to their surgeon? What are they thinking they're owed in virtue of their participation? That's a great question.
Thank you so much. Now, what are the main psychosocial characteristics of the volunteers for invasive brain research studies?
That is also a really good question. So part of how my collaboration started with a neurosurgeon was we were asking questions about altruism. We were asking questions about what types of patients want to volunteer for some of the studies, right? So if you kind of surveyed the public, or you had a larger sample size, you may find that very many people would not want to participate in some of this research. And so how does that play into how we approach patients? I don't think that anyone has done a robust study on this. I mean, part of answering this question would be to interview and talk to participants who were approached to enroll but didn't, declined. And that is part of our study as well. So far we've only interviewed the patients who said yes for the intraoperative research, but there are patients who have been approached and good candidates for the research that have said, no, thank you. I'd like to get my implant be done and on my way. And so that would be part of answering that question. We have had some narratives for other studies. So we have we've talked to patients in an early feasibility study for a cortical prosthesis device. And some of those patients have really expressed kind of extreme altruism, really just in their lives, being the types of people that want to give back to science and want to help others. So that's a crucial question, and I would say altruism is a big thing to study. That's a great question.
Absolutely. And I want to thank our audience for these great questions coming in. Are the invasive brain research study volunteers financially compensated and at what level?
Yeah, that is also a really good question. It depends, I would say. So different teams do things differently, especially for studies that are long-term, for really highly involved studies, BCI studies, studies where patients are really spending a lot of time coming into the lab and really being partners in the research process. Many teams do compensate, a significant amount for the participants' time. And some teams feel that compensation amounts to inducement, right? So if you offer money, there's some level of money that's okay, but it's probably likely too low. And once you kind of raise that level higher and higher, some ethicists and researchers really feel that you're moving away from compensation and you're moving towards kind of incentivizing participation. I don't think there's a consensus on this, so that is a serious area as well. That's a good question.
We have one more question. We have a couple questions more coming in. Could a team for consent have downsides such as increased patient confusion, decreased trust, higher costs?
These are fantastic questions. I would say it's possible. I think it depends how you do it, right? So increased or having a team for consent just for the purposes of having a team and having more people and more conversations, I don't think would necessarily meet some of those ethical benchmarks. But providing a really thoughtful process, I think, would increase trust and decrease confusion, right? So sometimes we think, providing opportunities for patients to develop that trust with multiple members of the team might be really important. And as would providing a kind of external person for the patient to confide in if they had any concerns that maybe they don't feel comfortable saying to a clinician. But I do think that's a really good point, that just more people is not necessarily better. I think we really need some focused research dedicated towards what practices would be optimal. That's a great point.
Thank you so much. We have time for two more questions. What do you think clinician researchers could do specifically to improve consent in intraoperative research?
Yeah, this is a good question too. I think, as I mentioned in this talk, I really do think being quite explicit during the surgery about an opportunity to withdraw. I think we tend to think of the intraoperative research as being kind of one solid chunk, but it can be 30 minutes long. There are multiple times to check in on the patient. There are multiple times to really kind of remind them of that opportunity. And I think it can become easy to assume that patients will say they would like to stop when they want to stop. And really, we don't quite understand what it's like for them to be in that situation. So I think being quite explicit about opportunities to withdraw, even building it into their formal consent, and being open to allowing more time for consent conversations at the beginning of the study as well.
Absolutely. We have time for one more question. Our final question is about IRB. What do you think IRB should look like for assessing content in practices for these types of studies?
Yeah, I have no idea. Actually, I think that question. I have no idea. I mean, I think, again, this is an area where research would be really helpful to have some data about what types of practices tend to correlate with what types of attitudes and decision-making processes. But I think at minimum, again, looking for thoughtfulness about reconsent, looking for thoughtfulness about withdrawing, and looking for consent and recruitment processes that are paying attention to that taxonomy that I proposed. Like who is the patient population? Your consent for this patient population should probably not look exactly the same as your consent processes for a different one. So yeah, nuance, but also we probably need research before I can answer that question.
Absolutely. Dr. Feinsinger, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for your presentation today. Do you want to provide the audience with any closing remarks before we go?
This was just a wonderful platform to have this discussion. I know this is a neuroscience conference, and so I really think it's wonderful that we have ethics conversations. And I do think that when we have these conversations together, it pushes the field forward in wonderful ways. So I'm just glad to be a part of it, and thank you.
Absolutely. Well, we thank you again for your time and for your important research. And before we go, I want to thank our audience for joining us today and for their interesting questions. Questions we did not have time for today and those submitted during the on-demand period will be addressed by our speaker via the contact information you provided at the time of registration. And this webcast can be viewed on demand for 2 years until 2024 of March. LabRoots will alert you via email when it's available for replay. We encourage you to share that email with your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Until next time, take care, everyone. Bye-bye.